Hey, everybody, hope you're doing well. I wanted to give sort of my feedback on this concept that's being tossed around Facebook. It's like yesterday, I was scrolling through Facebook. It's like every other post was about if you're allowed to trademark the term worship leader and what that really means. And I think there's a lot of fallacies that happen to exist stemming from this person's video. And I want to break those down and sort of tell you the truth about what's going on. But it sort of goes down to like trademark laws, like trademark 101, what's allowed, what's not allowed. And the title of the Christianity Today post was Company That Trademark Worship Leader Makes Others Drop the Term. There was another article from Relevant Magazine said, did a company actually trademark worship leader? And so I think it's a trademark interaction that's happening around that term worship leader. And there was a couple of companies, one called Rogue Worship Leader that has sort of a media department where they're doing TikToks and Facebooks and Instagram posts using that term Rogue Worship Leader. There was another Instagram page called Worship Leader Probs. And what's really interesting when you get down to the bottom of the story and what's actually happening, it's not necessarily true compared to what this guy's saying versus the truth. And so I'm going to play this video for you, react to it, and hopefully be able to share from my perspective what I think is actually going on here.
Hey, worship leaders. I want to share a little revelation that I found out this past week. Your ministry position, your job title, is actually a trademarked term.
Okay, that right there is just 100% a lie. So like I have people come in and do worship, lead worship all the time for me all around the country. Like even this month I was all over the place doing ministry events and we have worship leaders come and I say, "Hey, this is our worship leader, Zach McAnulty, who's the co-host of this podcast, Deep Waters. He comes to Nashville once a month and leads worship for us." I say, "This is our worship leader, Zach McAnulty." It's not trademarking of the role that you have somebody come into your house or come into your church or come into your ministry to be able to do. It's actually the brand that exists, which is Worship Leader Magazine. And Worship Leader Magazine's a ministry that stems all the way back to like basically the Jesus People movement out of the Vineyard and out of Chuck Smith and what you've seen happening there. And so the term that's trademarked is not the role that exists in a church, but it's a brand and a company that's built around that. And so the thing that I would be upset about if I started a company, Deep Waters, and it becomes a term and people started using Rogue Deep Waters podcast or whatever, I would be pretty upset because what they're doing is they're taking the brand that you own, that you've built, that you've made, Worship Leader Magazine, and they're causing confusion around it. And that's exactly what was happening here. People were confusing Worship Leader Magazine with Rogue Worship Leader and Worship Leader Probs and getting the three of those brands confused. And so they have the trademark all the way stemming back from my research to 1992. This guy a little bit later says 2016. From my research, they trademarked that term all the way back in 1992. And not only that, as I've done a little bit more research trying to get down to the bottom of what's happening, they for months and months and months and months have been working to amicably solve the problem with Rogue Worship Leader behind the scenes. And I think as far as they could tell, like they thought at the end of the day, they were going to resolve this conflict amicably. And then all of a sudden, this dude comes out and posts this video, which we're only 10 seconds into it. And one of the very first things he says is a bold faced lie. I mean, it's a bold faced lie, in my opinion, to come out and say, "Worship leader, your name is trademarked, your role at your church." No, your role at your church is not trademarked. You can call anybody that leads worship a worship leader. That's not what they're saying. But the brand that exists around it, the brand that exists around building a magazine specifically for worship leaders or any media that stems from that, Instagram and YouTube channels, any media that it stems from that is trademark, which means when other media companies like Rogue Worship Leader or Worship Leader Probs begins to rise up and it causes confusion and dilution in the ecosystem, of course you're going to go after them. I remember working inside of a church that had started a ministry called Starting Point, which was sort of like the first, second, third steps that they want newcomers in their church to take. And North Point Church, the church that Andy Stanley pastor, sent a cease and desist letter to this church that I was a part of, saying that you're not allowed to use our term Starting Point. That's what we use whenever there's when we're trying to get our newcomers involved, and we built a brand around it. You guys can't use that term. And I was like kind of offended at the time, but from my perspective, I understand what they're doing. They're starting a ministry, they're taking it around the nation. They want people to be able to use their curriculum that they're using. And if we're building something that's competing with that, then they don't want us to participate in doing that. So, although it seems a little like, gosh, that seems harsh to do that, Andy Stanley, North Point Church, starting point ministry that we're trying to do, I totally understand why they're doing that, because they don't want people to be confused. They don't want people coming to us when they're meaning to go to get the ministry that Andy Stanley's doing. I heard about a church recently too in Utah called Southeast Christian Church. Well, there's a really big Southeast Christian Church in Louisville, Kentucky, one of the biggest churches in the country. Southeast Christian Church in Utah, it constantly gets checks in the mail for people who are meaning to tithe to Kentucky. It's like people get it confused. So I can understand why Worship Leader Magazine has put a trademark down. And then once it reached a point where people were getting confused, tried to solve it amicably. And then whenever that didn't work, I ended up having to enforce it by reporting to social media companies that these people were infringing on their trademark because there's confusion and dilution in the brand.
And I'll tell you how I found this out. So last week, my Facebook page, Rogue Worship Leader, got taken down out of nowhere. I tried to log in, all of my content, all of my followers, gone. I actually got a notification from Facebook that I violated community guidelines. I was able to appeal, and through the appeal process, I actually found out that a company called Authentic Media LLC actually reported many of my posts for trademark infringement. The trademark that I was infringing was the term worship leader. So I did a little bit of digging, and I found out that back in 2016, Authentic Media LLC actually filed a trademark with the USPTO for the term worship leader. Why would they do that? Did a little bit more digging, and I found out that Authentic Media owns a company called Worship Leader. So the company Worship Leader is essentially reporting me for violating.
Yeah, exactly what I'm saying. Like they tried to solve it amicably. That didn't work out, and so they had to report that there's been trademark infringement. I 100% support what Worship Leader Magazine did because I understand from a business perspective and from the brand building perspective what they were doing. What this guy did, I feel like is egregious and wrong in the standpoint that he's making it out as if anybody that uses the term in their church worship leader as if this company is going to come after them. That's absolutely not true. And I actually think this guy should apologize because he knows what he's doing. He knows what he's doing is trying to create a video that's getting clicks and views and likes for the sake of trying to scare people in their churches to thinking that they can't use the word worship leader. I actually heard somebody in an interview this week just saying like, well, our worship leader is such and such. And they're like, actually, I'm sorry, we can't say worship leader anymore. Our worship pastor, and they quickly changed it. And they weren't doing it facetiously. They were doing it because they took what this guy was saying literally and was trying to adjust even the way that they talked about the people that were working at their church. And I find that disheartening. I find what this dude did incredibly wrong. And I reached out to him, and I'd love for him to come on the podcast with Zach and I to talk about his perspective of what he thinks going on. I reached out to the other people, worship probs or worship leader probs, and asked them if they would come on the show so we could talk about it and get their perspective if there's something that I'm missing. And it could be, I mean, and I don't necessarily expect that they'll reach out to us since we're a new podcast and we're smaller and things like that. But I would definitely enjoy to have the conversation with them and give them a safe space to talk through it. But from my perspective of what I know now, this dude started off his video with a bold-faced lie, which he knew was a bold-faced lie. They're not going after worship leaders in the church that are using that term. They're going after brands that are causing dilution and confusion in the ecosystem. And so that needs to be said and that needs to be dealt with. And so, anyways, there's my perspective so far. I'm sure that Zach and I will continue to cover it and talk about this worship leader prob